Hey everybody, this is John Simon here, and welcome to Church History for Chumps. I'm here with my good friend
Thomas Duell. I just dropped my
Thomas
pen.
Tuwell. Sorry about that, man. I kind of set you up for failure there.
Yeah,
Thomas is we're actually recording remote today because Thomas is poxed up, right, man?
yeah, dude. I got the Black Plague.
Yeah.
I'm having to shout unclean while I walk down the road and everything.
Yeah, we had a fun conversation where we were scheduled to record here in the dungeon today, and Tommy was like, "Well, I got the pox, man, but I mean, if you're willing to have me come through," and I was like, "I don't think I am." I realized I don't think I ever got chicken pox when I was younger too. I think I completely avoided it.
I did. That's what's messed up about this.
Yeah, you got the super pox, man.
Yeah, man. Maybe there's a big wave of it's gonna sweep the country, and I'm patient number zero.
Oh shoot, don't say that, man. 2024 is supposed to be a year of my spiritual advisor said that this is going to be a year of health and prosperity for me. So,
You're what? You're severe.
yeah, man, my man Johnny Stacks. Yeah, I have him on a subscription. I pay $300 a month,
There you go.
and he prays over me and sends me little vials of oil from Jerusalem.
That's incredible.
That stuff is hard to get these days.
It's true. It's true. Price is going
Oh
up.
man, your price is going up. Demand is going up too. All right, hey, so we're back on the heretic stuff. We're gonna be doing a fan favorite amongst heretics today. Our boy Pelagius, and this is Pelagianism. So you know anything about this guy, Tommy?
Yeah, I've heard people be accused of being Pelagian or semi-Pelagian for a long time.
Yeah,
I don't know a lot about Pelagius himself, but it seems like I'm actually excited for today's episode because it seems like one of those words. Well, like when we say like Arianism, for example,
hmm,
like everybody knows what that means, and we agree on what that means. Um, the idea that Jesus was created by God or what is not
right.
fully divine or something like that. But Pelagianism seems to be one that I don't know. Just I don't know if you've had the same experience, but it seems like uh, people mean different things by it sometimes, and or it can be thrown around
Yeah,
somewhat lightly. So I'm excited to learn more about its true roots.
yeah. It's one of those that's complicated, and I think that recent scholarship is making it more complicated because I think that historians are not quite convinced that what's been called Pelagianism was true Pelagianism. I think we'll get into that. It's honestly, it's kind of the issue that we ran into with Nestorianism and with the monophysite issue of the Eutychians, like a lot of people being given labels and being ascribed beliefs who would have not necessarily said that they believed that. But I also think that whether Pelagius believed in Pelagianism or not, Pelagianism, as it stands, as a definition, is still very much a problem in the church today because I think Pelagianism. I'm going to call it the Walt Disney heresy in a second here, and I'll explain why. But so let's talk about Pelagianism. So, back in the day, Pelagius, he was a man born in 354 AD. So we're back in the fourth century. This is going to take place. Actually, I was telling Tommy earlier, this is going to overlap with Nestorianism, and people are going to actually consider Nestorianism to be kind of the sister heresy because they're going to kind of overlap with each other. However, my readings were not detailed enough to really get into that, so I'm probably not going to mention Nestorianism a ton more than this. But Pelagius was a British Roman, so he was born in Great Britain that was occupied by Rome at the time, which makes him, and we'll get into this, a Celtic Christian. And that
Huh.
is interestingly going to inform a lot of his theology and possibly kind of get into why he was maybe not represented very accurately, depending on who you believe in this. I'm not even sure who to believe. But so he was not a priest. A lot of the dudes who kind of headed up these heresies for a while were either priests or bishops, like Nestorius or Apollinarius. He was none of those. He was a monk, and he was very much given to the monastic lifestyle. And he was just a well-respected dude in his area, lived in the Roman part of Britain, and eventually would move down to Rome. And when he moved to Rome, he was really struck by what he believed was a really lax kind of moral attitude that the Christians in Rome had. I think he'd probably been sold this idea that Rome was this beautiful center of, mature Christianity. And when he showed up, he was like, these people are not living like very morally upright lives at all. And he was really disappointed. He was like, this place sucks. And it actually came to a head when he heard a bishop reading a pretty well known text where a theologian was kind of just talking about his issues with the ladies. He was talking about his issues with sexuality and with the sin of lust, and he was pleading for grace to come and intervene in his life to kind of break the cycle of sin that he felt like he was stuck in. Thomas, I love hitting you with quizzes. Do you have any guess as to what text I'm talking about here?
What text was being quoted?
Yeah,
No, I don't got no guesses.
it's Confessions by Saint Augustine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Nice.
yeah.
I wanted to say this reminds me of Augustine.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, dude. If it's about the ladies, it's
Yeah,
Augustine.
yeah, that's what
um,
dude was a lover boy.
he
Really
was.
nice.
So for those of you guys who don't know, Augustine, one of the probably I'd say easily the most influential theologian of the fourth century, probably beyond that. But Augustine had gone on this very wild journey where he was kind of a secular dude for a while. He was kind of caught up in philosophies for a while. He got wrapped up in Manichaeism, which is this Eastern sort of Christian sect that was very about like matter is evil, the human body is evil, and eventually landed under the teachings of Saint Jerome, who was a bishop and became a Christian, and they became very influential. And Augustine, as a young man, just really really struggled with lust and with sex and with the ladies. And he wrote this incredible book that honestly I would encourage anyone to read today. It's one of my favorite older texts, which is called Confessions, where it's written like a biography slash long journal entry where he basically kind of talks through his life. But it's almost like as he's writing, he's not writing to himself. It's like he's writing it to God. So he's
Yeah.
constantly kind of like speaking of the tragedies of his life and the terrible mistakes that he made, but he's always like returning it with like this really warm uplifting praise to God.
Yeah, dude, it's been a long time since I read Confessions. I think it was like in high school that I read it.
Yeah,
Um, I'd like to return to it.
dude. Yeah, I think the last time I read through it was probably college. But if you've ever heard the quote, shoot, now I'm gonna drop the ball on it. It's the heart of man is restless and will forever remain restless until it rests in thee, because we were made for God. Like I
Yeah.
completely butchered that quote, but that's from Confessions. It's his idea that like the
I think
the
it's
this
something like our hearts are made for you, O God, and they are
mm,
restless until they rest in you.
you nailed it. Yeah, that was perfect. Yeah. I learned kind of a sing-songy version, which I think goes, the restless heart will restless be until it finds its rest in thee. But yeah, no, you nailed it. So yeah, Confessions is super good. So Augustine starts to become this pretty influential dude, as he's brought into the priesthood and he starts to teach and kind of, spread his theological wings, and he writes Confessions, which is altogether a pretty unusual book because it wasn't quite a theological piece, but it also wasn't a biography either. But it kind of gained traction as much as something can without a printing press. So people were basically jotting it down and carrying it out to people. And our boy Pelagius hears a bishop reading it aloud, and he's offended by it. He's completely he's like repulsed by this idea. And he's not just repulsed at its representation of Augustine's former sinful life, but he is repulsed by this idea that Augustine was pleading for grace to intervene in his life as a sinner. He was
Mm,
basically say like Pelagius would essentially say in his teachings, God wouldn't command us to do something that we don't have the power to do. So Augustine saying, God, please give me the grace to, not do X, Y, and Z, like that's just making an excuse. Like God gave you the power as a person filled with the Spirit of God to, or I'm sorry, I'm not even sure he would say the Spirit of God part, but he would say God gave you the power of being a person, made in the image of God, that you don't have to do the types of evils that you do. When Scripture tells us, "Be holy, for I am holy," like that's a command, and why would God command us to do something that we're not actually capable of doing?
mm.
So Pelagius kind of creates this argument, and it's worth noting that at this point in church history it wasn't completely locked down, this idea of federal headship and all of us carrying the guilt of Adam on our shoulders.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
interesting because that's the first thing that came to mind was it
mhm.
seems to not even be operating within that framework. So what do you mean when you say like it wasn't locked down at this time in history?
I think that a lot of the preceding theologians like Clement and Irenaeus and Origen, they had all written on sin. And I think there was always this assumption that we are obviously capable of sin. But um, where it really comes in is this idea of will. Like,
Right.
what is your will in relation to um, like sin? Because
Yeah.
when people tends to look at the
What's
free
the
will
extent of the
debate,
curse?
yeah, exactly. Because when people tends to look at this debate about free will, uh it's not really like people tends to debate about free will as far as like, are we robots or are we not robots? Can we do things or can we not do things? Pelagius is going to say, well, and I think a lot of this, interestingly, was informed by his Celticness, which, if some of our listeners remember, some of our conversations that we had with the esteemed Dr. Brad Mella back in the day, the Celts had a deep love and appreciation for creation. And again, as we often see, heretics tends to be, or people who swing too far in a heretical view are often repelled by another heretical view.
Mhm.
And the thing about Augustine was people knew this dude used to ride with the Manichaeans, who had a very loathsome view of creation. And so you got to think Pelagius is a Celt who loves creation and who thinks that creation is touched with this beautiful divine spark of God. And he sees this dude who very conveniently used to be a Manichaeist, which basically meant that he hated creation and thought that we needed to be delivered from it. And he sees this viewpoint and he's like, no, 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 that's not it. God created all things to be good, and God created all things good. So if creation is inherently valuable and divine, then it goes to show that human beings are also like inherently divine.
Mm.
So
You know
you
what
don't inherit sin like that.
that makes me think what we're dealing with here is not just a misunderstanding of headship, but we're also dealing with a misunderstanding of like the creation itself. I'm immediately thinking about Romans 8,
Mm-hmm.
where uh, in a way, human beings have some sort of like just how like we have you use the term federal head over us, where it's basically like wherever Adam goes, I go, or wherever Christ goes, I go. Or for the Israelites, um, who are, in the wilderness, wherever Moses goes, I go, that sort of thing. It's almost like the creation has human beings as their head. And
Mm,
human beings are given this responsibility to care and cultivate for the creation. But when human beings are touched by sin, cursed by sin, um, the curse naturally extends to all of creation because of that. But
hmm
human beings are like a different, because they're made in the image of God, they're different. And so, like, my dog, for example, is he is affected by the curse of sin.
hmm
He is part of all creation that is groaning, as Romans 8 says, in anticipation of all things being made new.
hmm
But my dog has never sinned.
hmm
Um, my dog has never disobeyed God's law. He's always acted in conformity with how God made dogs to act, but
Right.
he experiences the effects of it. Me, different story, right? I
hmm
experience the effects of it, but I also bear a unique curse as a
Right.
son of Adam. And it seems like that category is missing of like, yes, human beings are part of the creation by nature of being created, but
hmm
they also are at a different level than the rest of creation that has special blessings and curses.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a good point. And I think the bummer about Pelagius is that I think when a lot of people accuse others of being Pelagians, of basically believing that humans are not born inherently sinful, it's because they tend to have kind of like this like loose and carefree idea of the law, and like, we're not born sinful, and sin itself really isn't all that bad. But Pelagius was not that guy at all. Like, he was not like the hippie, do as thou wilt type guy, because he believed that we were capable of, that the law was sufficient for salvation. I think he has a quote, or at least a quote that's attributed to him oftentimes by different authors, was, because perfection is possible, it is mandatory. And that's like a terrifying idea when you think about it, because it's like, because you can do better and you're not being oppressed by an external force, like, there's nothing holding you back. You have no excuse for anything less than perfection. And so the reason I call him the Walt Disney of heretics is because, since he doesn't believe that sin is an inherent part of our nature, um he's almost like, you have to be true to yourself, like the self that is actually good. Like, you have to be true to yourself and work your way to doing all of the things that you ought to do. And then grace isn't needed to break the stone and, hardness in your heart. Grace is almost like a bonus that we receive after we kind of climb our way out of the pit ourselves. And yeah, so it's actually not, I mean, there's nothing, to me, there's nothing compelling about like a heresy like this. This sounds like an extreme burden that it puts on people. Like, it sounds like an attractive heresy for like, maybe like really type A kind of people. But for me, someone who is constantly aware of how much mercy and grace I need, not just for past sins, but for the hope of defeating future temptations. Like, this sounds awful. Like, this doesn't sound compelling to me at all.
Yeah, I can see some of the because this is kind of a recurring theme throughout, and this is why I think Pelagianism gets um, people get accused of Pelagianism at different points in church history because there is something sort of attractive of um, I think that people look at human beings and see their ability to reason, their ability to uh, to use their will, and then they reverse engineer from that
Hmm.
instead of letting Scripture be our guide. And so, I am not a professional in any sense of the word when it comes to Thomas Aquinas and his thought.
Hmm.
And I may have to retract this in the future. And if you're a Thomist, please hop in our comments and contribute to this conversation. But from what I understand, Thomas Aquinas was not Pelagian in any sense of the word, and that he absolutely would affirm original sin and its effect on human beings.
Hmm.
Um, but I think if I understand Aquinas's thought correctly, Aquinas would argue that our I think it was our reason was untouched by
Hmm.
original sin, and thus we can reason our way to God, which is kind of an Aristotelian way of thinking of like you
Yeah.
can use these tools of logic to work your way to the existence of God, the necessity for God, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Calvin up against Aquinas, and this is where you and I would land.
Hmm.
Um, you may have heard of the term total depravity. That oftentimes is misunderstood as uh, Calvin is saying that every part of a person is the worst it could be. That's not what total depravity means. It just
Hmm.
means that every aspect of our lives, our mind, our body, our soul, our will, and our reason have all been touched by sin.
Yep.
And there is a capacity there for great darkness, but every part of us has been touched by sin in a way that grace is required in
Hmm.
order to bring us to God in any area, even with our reason. So I think,
And we wouldn't be a proper reformed podcast if we didn't, always remind people that when Calvin was formulating these views on total depravity, he was referencing a very Augustinian view of what sin and the will and how it affected the human mind was. So, this is obviously something that reformed people love to highlight, but yeah, like in Calvin's mind, we were actually restoring a very Augustinian view of what sin was. And we talk about the will, and there's this interesting kind of debate that goes on between Pelagius and Augustine, and it often has to do with these terms of freedom versus the will. Pelagius would say, because there are so many moralistic commands in the scriptures, it's very clear that we do have a free will. Like we are able to do what God is commanding us to. Otherwise, he would be a cruel and unfair God to say, do this and then not give us the opportunity to actually do that thing. Augustine is saying that this idea of freedom is kind of obscured because what he says is that um, the will is acted upon by forces greater than us. And I think that like the idea that we have a free will is like an illusion. Like it's like saying that if I took a marble and I rolled it across the floor that it's moving freely. Well, it's not moving freely. It's affected by gravity, which is keeping it from floating off into space. It's affected by me who just, used my kinetic energy to roll it forward. It's affected by the texture of the floor and how that's disrupting it. Like there's all of these different forces that are acting upon it, even if it looks to be acting freely. And, when we think of ourselves and how we relate with the world around us, like saying that we don't have free will. I mean, it's frustrating because I feel like it requires so many asterisks to explain that I don't think I've ever preached a sermon where I've said we don't have free will just because it sets off so many alarms for people that it's hard to kind of put out that fire. But what it really means is that freedom is not something that we are afforded because there are so many external factors acting upon us.
yeah,
Like, yeah.
Anybody who lives in a more animistic culture or has any sort of sense of the spiritual realm in a way that we don't here in America would not speak of their life as being free in the sense that we like to here.
Mm-hmm.
There's a real sense of like where human beings fall in the cosmos, and like that there are things that are more powerful than us, whether we're talking about spiritual forces or just the reality that we live in a covenantal world. Like
Mm-hmm.
the world that God made operates under the context of covenants, and there's headship built into that, and you don't have to like it, but that's the
Mm-hmm.
reality of the world that we live in.
Right. Yeah, I think just like yeah, the reality of the world that we live in is like recognizing that regardless of what culture you're kind of adopted into when you're born, you're you're inevitably going to be compelled to do certain things. Like there are like and a lot of the times these cultures are in fact sinful. Like if I uh shoot, I don't know. I've been trying to think of like just a plain Jane example of being compelled by sin, but I got stuck on that marble one, which I felt really good about. So, um, yeah, gosh,
While
dude.
you think of it, I'll read this
Yeah.
quote here I wrote down a few weeks ago. There was a Swiss theologian named Emil Brunner. Have you ever heard of him?
Ooh, the name strikes a chord, but I'm
I
not
think he
sure.
was a contemporary with Karl Barth, but
Okay. Okay.
he so Emil Brunner, I didn't know this when I wrote this quote down, but my mind had gone back to it. But Emil Brunner was part of the neo-Orthodox movement, which rejected totally Pelagianism and
Hmm.
any idea of like human cooperation with God and our salvation. I think you'll like this quote. He says,
Yeah.
so he uses the word lees here, which is Lees, which is it's like the sediment at the bottom of like a wine bottle, when
Okay.
wine's going bad.
Yeah.
So he says the sinful human being is a vessel in which the lees of sin transform the wine of the knowledge of God into the vinegar of idolatry.
That is really good. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to like kind of show how um, man left to its own devices, like if idolatry is always the result of even the knowledge of God. Like
Mhm.
just learning something about God or his creation without grace is going to turn into even more just sinful product.
Right, right. And even like I feel like the Pelagians had such a huge obstacle in scripture to actually prove this case because Romans is very clear that we are either like bond servants or slaves of sin or slaves of Christ. And I don't think that's meant to remove this idea that we're responsible for our actions or that we're capable of acting out of free will, but it's recognizing that as created beings there are forces larger than us that are acting upon us. And I think that, for the people who wanted to label Augustine as just a closet Manichaeist, and say, oh, well, he's operating from this like dualistic mindset. Like he would actually define sin not as an opposing force going against God, but actually as a vacuum that has the absence of God. So he's
Mm,
basically saying like, hey, you can live within this like bubble of air where you can breathe, which is God's grace and spirit and presence, or you can live outside of this bubble of air where there's water and you drown. Like, but there's like so there's the presence of God and there's the absence of God, but you are never just able to like I don't know, exert your will upon the world around you because we're not gods. Like we don't actually have that level of influence to where our will is so like powerful that we can just kind of like, bring it into existence around us.
yeah.
Yeah. So
That's good. So how was this dealt with? You said that it was dealt with at the same time as Nestorianism?
yeah, so at the Council of Ephesus, which was the council that Nestorianism was shot down, that was also when Pelagianism was also found heretical. Pelagius, I think, had honestly, Pelagius had a really big deal of influence, and so Nestorianism, we talked about that in a couple episodes ago, where it kind of went historically in a different direction. Obviously, Nestorianism kind of resonated quite a bit with the Eastern Church, and I think a lot of that was chalked up to cultural differences. Pelagianism, I think, was actually compelling not so much because of a cultural viewpoint, but because of the theology itself. And like I said before, like I think that Pelagianism, if there was a heresy that we could ascribe to the humanist world that we see around us, it would be Pelagianism. It's because, if you look at a freaking Walt Disney movie, it's all telling you to be yourself, to find that
Mm,
true
yeah.
self and to be true to it. Because if you're true to your honest, good self, then you'll do well. Then once you crack into your identity at your most concentrated state, then you will flourish and you will be good and you will do good things. And I can't even say as Calvinists, I think as Christians, we know that's not true because we believe that at our core, we're not actually good, but we're selfish and prideful.
It really is, I think, one of the oldest temptations and lies. We could call it bootstrap theology. Like
Mm-hmm.
we see it all the way back with Cain and
Yeah.
Abel, like this uh like the compulsion of the desire to lift ourselves up out of our problems. I mean, that's literally what humanism is.
Yes.
We see it take on full. I mean, you could make an argument that that's what the first 10 chapters of Genesis are about, is
Mm-hmm.
humans trying to uh, build for themselves a way out of the problem that they're in.
Yeah.
Um, and it takes a culmination at the Tower of Babel, which is humanism.
Mm-hmm.
And, humanism is alive and well today. It's alive and well in our theology. It's alive and well in our pulpits,
Mm-hmm.
how we talk about sin, the holding grace at arm's length because it requires submission is tale as old as time.
Yeah. Dude, have you ever seen a show called The Good Place?
No, I think it sounds familiar, but I don't know anything
Oh
about it.
man, dude. So, all right, I'm gonna rant about this for a second. So, The Good Place, it's I think the same dudes that did like Parks and Rec and The Office. So it kind of has that flavor of humor on it. But it was an NBC show, and the premise of it was that a handful of people die and they go to and well okay, so the system of this world, it's like a bunch of Hollywood writers sat down and wrote up their own idea of what the afterlife is. And so in this system, every human receives a number of points for every virtuous thing that they do, and they lose a number of points based on every terrible thing that they do. And they always incorporate like
Hmm.
jokes, like,
Just like
you lose.
15th century Roman Catholic theology.
Well, it'll be things like, you lose 30 points if you like take up more than one parking space, but you gain 10 points every time you like your lonely aunt's Facebook post, or
Nice.
things like that. It's very, very, very modern, very relevant to us. But the interesting thing is that as the series develops, they kind of reveal that this system of the afterlife is inherently broken. Like it doesn't really work because there's this interesting kind of plot where there's a character who he's only in like one or two episodes, but he goes on like a drug trip or something, and he has this revelation where he understands how the universe works. He understands how this afterlife system works. And so he commits his life to doing as little harm as possible and trying to accumulate enough points so that he can earn his way to the afterlife. And so he lives in like complete seclusion, and like when the characters, like when the main cast meets up with him, he's like this horribly neurotic guy who is terrified about like all of the things that he says and all of the things that he does because he's afraid of the long-term effects of what those will be. And well, what if my positive action actually leads to a negative action down the road and I'm held morally culpable for it? And he just commits himself to like he lives in complete isolation. He lives off the land, but he like commits to eating and consuming like stuff with as small of a carbon footprint as possible. So he eats like a handful of like dried lentils, and he like drinks water that's like repurposed from his like excrement, and it's just like
He
a
sounds
shameful.
Buddhist.
Yeah, dude, it's like this shameful way to live. But the irony is that at the end of it, he still doesn't make it because his actions are so utterly steep, like because even if he was to live in isolation, now he's living selfishly. But if he were to live in community, now he's living sinfully because he's not loving people well enough. And so it's this
Damned if you
really
do, damned if you
interesting.
don't.
What's that?
Said damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Dude, 100%. And so this show is kind of it's this like humanist rejection of like the secular heaven afterlife model. And then it kind of goes on to say like the way the series ends, spoiler for everyone watching this like 10-year-old show, is that the main characters essentially get tasked with rewriting how this system works. And it basically turns into kind of this Hindu, or no, I'm sorry, not Hindu, Buddhist cycle of reincarnation where you go through like divine therapy where everyone has these opportunities to get better and to grow. And it's really very much this regurgitation of everyone is good, they just need the opportunity to learn from their mistakes and to become as good as possible. But then they eventually transcend. Once you get to heaven, the good place, it's this place of unfiltered pleasure, which of course they only show the pleasures like flying around, never the pleasures like what if a dude really likes raping people. Yeah, they never show that.
Right.
I guess those branches get hemmed a little bit. And then the irony is that at the eventually all the characters get bored of this paradise, and so they basically create an out where you can just stop existing. And that's the great end, is that you basically just die, like eternally die and just go into unexistence. So it's
That's
this mystery.
fascinating. Yeah.
Dude, it's super interesting thinking that like a bunch of humanists basically wrote a revision for what the afterlife looks like. But I think what really fascinated me in the context of Pelagianism is they recognize that even if we do assume that everybody is good enough, like if we equate good by the amount of positive that we exert and negative that we remove, we can't do it. We still can't do it. Like, and I think that what Pelagianism inherently fails to recognize is that sin is not just saying I know what the rules are and I choose to break them. Sometimes sin is saying I know what the rules are and I desire to keep them and I break them by accident. Like
Mm.
sin is not just saying I want to be a scumbag. Sometimes sin is saying I want to be the best person possible, and then you end up being a scumbag and just missing the mark.
That makes me think of that meme where it's like the two astronauts on the moon, and one of them's looking back at the Earth, and it's like the wait, it's always been, and then the other astronaut's like always has been, and he's pointing a gun at his head from behind. Do you know that
Yeah.
meme? I feel like
Yeah.
it's like that meme. It's like or learning about covenant theology. You're like, wait, it's not about a scale. Like, never has been.
Yeah, exactly. Like just never had a chance. And just Like, and that's Augustine's whole thing is like, look, if we had the ability to judge sin appropriately, then maybe we would have had a chance. We still wouldn't have, but our even deeper problem is our scale is broken. Like our perspective is broken. Like because we're so utterly affected by sin, like we can't do this by ourselves. We can't commit to bootstrapped theology. And that I mean like and what's so interesting to me is like look at the structure of like anonymous programs here in like 21st century culture. Like the first thing is recognizing that you need to acknowledge a higher power because you don't have the power of recovery within yourself. It needs to come from the outside. And that is a complete rejection of a cultural Pelagianism, which says that if you just get down to the core of who you are, then you can fix it. Then you can become the person that you're destined to be. Then you can break whatever sins. It actually says, no, you can't. And I think for me, as a sinner, like as a person who is deeply imperfect and affected by sin every day, it's actually really beautiful to say, like, at the end of at the end of my day, at the end of my struggle, at the end of my season, it's it's not me that I need to look into. It's not me that holds the keys for success. I actually need to look well outside of myself. And I need to say, Lord Jesus, have mercy on me, a sinner. Like that's actually where my hope is found, not in myself, but in the one who's standing ready to save me.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah. I it made me think of the lyrics to the hymn, "Yet not I, but through Christ in me." I don't know if you're
Mm,
familiar with that one.
mm,
Just made me think of one of the. I mean, there's like a peace that comes from realizing that that's our position, right? Because like you were just describing, because it puts the heavy lifting on Christ, which
mm,
we are then the language that we are given. It's not that we don't have any um like like we're just robots that need to be reprogrammed by God. But because of grace, grace then enables us to obey Him, to
mm,
love Him, and the language that's used is actually to abide, right?
mm,
Like it's just to, which is like remaining in something. It's not this proactive striving so much as it is um, resting in the place that gives you life.
mm,
Um, anyway, the couple of the lines from that song: "No fate I dread, I know I am forgiven. The future sure, the price it has been paid. For Jesus bled and suffered for my pardon, and he was raised to overthrow the grave. To this I hold, my sin has been defeated. Jesus now and ever is my plea. Oh, the chains are released. I can sing, I am free. Yet not I, but through Christ in me."
yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. I think that as two pastors we both are, um, I know something that we've spoken about and something that I think a lot of ministers are very aware of especially when we're prepping sermons or when we're thinking about discipling someone, is recognizing that deep in the heart of every Christian, there are two very loud voices. And one is the voice of an antinomian, which is probably a heresy that we'll cover eventually. The idea that there is no law, there is no calling or commandment, like we're loved by God and there's nothing that we're not expected to die to ourselves. And then there's the voice of a Pelagian, which says that we are the masters of our domain. We need to work harder. We need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And both of those voices, although they come from opposite ends, it's not the angel and the devil. It's two devils.
Yeah.
And I think I have recognized throughout my life that there is a Pelagian voice in my heart telling me that if only I was able to work harder, if only I was able to really exert my devotion to Christ better, if only I was just cut from a better cloth, then the BS that I deal with in my life wouldn't be there. Then I wouldn't be as joyless. Then I wouldn't be as depressed. I wouldn't be as anxious. And I think as I'm saying this to myself and kind of ministering to my own spirit right now, I want to just also say to to really everyone listening, like um this thought of if you exert yourself more, you will then receive more of God's blessings. Like that's a satanic thought. Like God, like the when we think of the story of the prodigal son, that father was not thinking of his son who was off doing Lord knows what, spoiling his inheritance. He wasn't thinking, boy golly, I sure freaking hope my son gets a job and starts working harder and maybe like I don't know, gets like a 401k and starts working for a really nice company and settles down with a nice young gal. Like no, he's like, I want my son to come home. Like I want my son to be back in my arms. And and yeah, I think that when we feel that like extreme pull to just like try harder, that doesn't mean we shouldn't exert ourselves. That doesn't mean that we're not called in a way to work out our salvation, but it's not working out our salvation as if like our salvation depends on our effort. It's recognizing that our salvation exists because God has looked at us with favor and with love and has called us his beloved, and now we get to express that. But it's not like God is not looking at you with love because you're hot stuff who figured things out. And
Yeah.
and yeah, I mean, and that's a sermon that I've preached a million times because there's Pelagians in my church, there's Pelagians in yours, there's a Pelagian in my heart. But I think, you know, like I said earlier, like historians are kind of in a disagreement about whether Pelagius believed this stuff or not. I had a cool conversation with Brad really briefly about how much Pelagius's Celtic Christianity could have informed his views and how he may have actually been misrepresented because of that. But again, I still say whether Pelagius was a Pelagian or not, it doesn't change the fact that this heresy exists today because it's the heresy that tells us that we got to try harder, and it's a poisonous thing.
I I have a friend. His name is Steve Nicholas, and he oftentimes will, if he's meeting with someone that he's counseling, and they say, "Oh, I've been doing better in relation to like struggling against a certain sin," he'll often say, "Better, better than what? Like better
Mm,
than like what Christ has already accomplished for you?" And I I kind of like that way of, or that line of thinking of like there's, we do walk in sanctification. We do draw near to God, and our actions are should be brought more and more into conformity to God's will. But we can never do better. Like
mm,
one aspect of Protestant theology that I think is a really good contribution to the, you know, church history Hall of Fame is kind of the formulation of the active and passive obedience of Christ,
mm,
where Christ's passive obedience is his, you know, bearing the curse for us and taking on suffering and dying on our behalf. But his active obedience was fulfilling the law, like
mm,
living in perfect obedience to God's law, and that is imputed to us. Like we receive that when we are justified before God, and we'll probably talk about that if we ever get into like 20th century Presbyterian history and talk about like J. Gresham Machen or anything like that. But
mm.
yeah, that's a beautiful doctrine to hold on to, the active obedience of Christ on our behalf.
Yeah. Yeah, dude, I've been I remember you told me that story about your buddy who told you that about doing better, and like I think of that pretty consciously. I would say
Oh,
like
really?
weekly I think of that,
Really?
especially if someone asks me, you know, something that would make me say like, "Oh, I've been doing better." It makes me think like better than the blood of Jesus, like better than his perfect sacrifice or his, you know, eternal love for me. Like I don't know. Like that's a cool thing to hang our hats on. And I think that yeah, I mean it's just cool that the church was able to land in this direction. And again, like I think that from a historical standpoint, it does necessitate us saying that like I don't really think that this issue. Like I actually read through a couple of Pelagius's letters that he wrote kind of defending himself after he'd been deposed, and they were largely composed of statements that he had been accused of making that he denied ever making, and a lot of them really fit snug with this idea that he didn't believe that grace was required for salvation or things like that. So I think that history has kind of smoothed over and simplified a lot of his views to where he as a historical figure would probably say, that's not really what I meant when I said that. But again, like I think that Pelagianism as it stands, as an idea that says that human beings are not inherently sinful and do not need Christ's grace to break us into like obedience. Like I think that's still a very common thing. But yeah. So and Brad's always, Brad's a big component of like heresy is something that's kind of used to uh weaponize theological diversity and sometimes ignores cultural differences, which we kind of talked about in the last couple episodes. So it can get trickier. But hey,
Yeah,
Brad's also going to talk to us about Gnosticism in a few weeks. So that'll be exciting.
Brad,
Yeah.
heresy's still heresy at the end of the day.
It is. No, it is. It is. And I think even Brad would totally say that too. It's really just like the lens that we adopt and how we portray those who we're labeling heretics, I think can be challenging because like you and I can have a disagreement. If you're my pastor, I could choose to leave your church, and I could leave, and I could leave for a very solid reason. But the things that we tell other people about what each of us were doing could definitely skew the reality of that situation.
Yeah.
So that's where it
Yeah,
gets
no,
complex.
cultural stuff does play a big role. I mean, I remember hearing a story recently about how African missionaries or Western missionaries going to Africa in like the 20th century had to kind of take a step back and think really hard about how they were dealing with certain cultures that they were running into that were practicing polygamy
Mm,
because these people were converting to Christianity and then their American missionary pastors were telling them like, well, you have to like you can't be a polygamist, and it was creating like widespread cultural devastation because there was like no uh basically no safety net for all of these women and children,
yep.
downwind of this that were like basically being abandoned. And so it got dynamic real quick.
Yeah.
They had to
Yeah.
like figure out like, okay, how do we like actually how do we bring the gospel to bear on
Right.
this culture without denying the truth of God's word and the
Hmm.
requirements of his word and his commands,
Yeah.
while also not just senselessly, creating you know, tons and tons of orphans.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like it reminds me of when Jesus said that Sabbath was made for man and not the other way around. Like it's kind of like, well, like the idea of monogamy and really all ways in which we're following God's law is for flourishing. Like it's good. It's supposed to be a blessing to us. It doesn't mean it's going to be super fun or super easy, but ultimately everything that God is calling us into is supposed to be for our good. So if we're holding to something so rigidly that it's actually causing us a curse instead, like that doesn't mean that we're now exempt from it, but it does mean that maybe we should be a little more creative in how we should be expressing that. So yeah. All
Well,
righty,
this has
dude.
been good, man.
Good old Pelagianism. Yeah. Well, guys, listeners, we super appreciate you being on board. I've noticed a few people have been jumping on our Instagram lately and just shouting us out, and that's been super, super awesome. Um, I've also last Friday, this is several Fridays from now if you're listening to it when it's dropped. I just did like a bunch of Q&A stuff on our stories, and it was a lot of fun, and we got some cool responses and just, led to some cool little interactions, and I'm going to keep doing that cuz it was fun, and I want to keep connecting with some of the people who listen to the show. I don't want to call them followers cuz that sounds like we're I don't know. I don't think we have followers. We have listeners, right?
You mean you don't want to give everybody like a cult nickname?
Yeah, our boy Mordecai, you know.
No, I meant like, calling everybody like lovers or
Oh my
something dumb like
gosh.
that.
Oh man. Dude, do you think there's a possibility that a podcast could actually get that kind of clout to
Oh,
where
100%, dude. That's
oh,
where we're at culturally. I feel like a cult leader definitely has a podcast these days.
that makes my stomach hurt. Which if you've seen the good
That's
place,
just the
great good
guilt.
place
That's just the latent guilt in your
because
heart.
I know that I'm actually capable of that
Yeah.
as a
That
leader and a follower.
that's good. When they interview people and they've asked them if they ever think that they could, be like a Nazi death camp guard, and they say, "No, I could never." That's actually psychologically, that's
Ooh.
step one towards actually being a Nazi prison camp guard. Is not thinking that you could pull it off, which kind of ties in with our Pelagianism
That's
conversation if you
right.
really
That's
think
right.
about it.
If you don't think you're capable of sin, you're in for a world of sin,
Yep.
probably.
Yep.
Sweet. Well, thanks, dude. I'm glad we still got to chat even with I hope your pox heals up, man. I hope that
Thanks,
you're
brother.
clear soon. And
Hmm.
again, folks, thanks for listening. We'll catch you real soon. God bless.
Bless you.